If it's your first time joining us at Chevalier's Online, welcome. And for any of our old friends, welcome back. Quick note before we get in, there will be an audience Q&A later on in the evening, at which point you can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to unmute yourself. But until then, we ask that you please keep your microphone on silent because we're very, very thrilled to have with us tonight Robert Ritchie for his new book, The Lure of the Beach. Roy is a senior research associate at the Huntington Library and author of Captain Kidd and the War Against the Pirates. And he's joined in conversation tonight with our very own Darryl Holter. In addition to being an adjunct professor in history at USC, an author, musician, and occasional fly fisherman, Darryl is one of the co-owners of our lovely bookstore, and we're thrilled to have both of them with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Kelsey, and it's a very nice introduction. And I'm so happy to introduce my friend Roy Ritchie tonight for this very unusual and wonderful book, The Lure of the Sea. Roy is a really interesting person. He was born in Scotland. He was in Toronto until age 9. He moved then to California. He went to school went to the university or the Oxford College, on to do a doctorate in early American history at UCLA, and then UC San Diego Department of History, and then the research director at the Huntington Library, which he served in that position for something like 20 years, and really built up the research program at the Huntington Library during this period. Those of you who worked with the Huntington Library during this period probably experienced some of those research fellows that were brought into the Institute, some of the finest scholars from around the world under Roy's purview there. He also was one of the founders of the two new research entities between USC Department of History and the Huntington Library, the Early Modern Studies Institute and the Institute on California in the West. So those are some of the really great achievements that Roy did in his period with the Huntington Library. And we're so happy to be able to bring Roy to you and to have him talk about this wonderful new book. It's an extremely interesting book. It's a point of entry into all sorts of things having to do with our world and our American economy and the European economy, and something that we might not have thought about, the importance or the way in which knowing about the evolution of the beach, the development of the beach, has had an impact on even our contemporary life. And so, Roy, this wonderful and very unusual book, but I have to ask this question because I just wonder, where were you when you got the inspiration to write this book? And I was imagining that you were maybe you were at the beach, lounging on the beach in Santa Monica or someplace, and all of a sudden this came to you, or maybe you were toiling away in the stacks of the Huntington Library on something. And where did this idea come to you?
It's serendipitous. When I was research director, I really liked giving lectures, and I gave lectures quite regularly, and I tried to move around and not just do pirates. I did more pirate talks than I ever really cared to think about. And so in the end, I was always looking around for subjects to talk about, and bumped into Alain Corban's book, The Lure of the Sea, which is something about resorts, among other things. It got me thinking about it. I'd lived in Del Mar for 22 years, never really thought about the beach, even though it was just at the bottom of the street, as a historical subject. But I thought I will put a lecture together. So I went off, chug. It's mostly images. And again, this is a serendipitous part. There was an editor for the LA Times in the audience. The editor thought, hey, this is kind of interesting, who then had it end up being a story in the LA Times, which was seen by an editor for the University of California Press, who said, gee, wouldn't you like to do a picture book? Because I'd mostly shown pictures. And I said, sure. And I agreed to do it, and then started out hunting down a lot of images. Then I retired, and when I retired, I started looking at things more seriously. It was a matter of going and doing a lot of archival research, and I didn't pick up much at the beach. It was mostly in libraries here and there. So let me show a few images, because I think the hardest thing for folks to grasp is how beach resorts actually got started. We all, they're a worldwide phenomenon. They're everywhere. We all want to go to Phuket, you name it. And so it's grown from something that originated in the 1730s in England to this worldwide phenomenon. We all know the worldwide phenomenon. We see the advertisements all the time for beaches and all the fancy magazines. But what we don't understand is, where did all this come from? And while, yes, there was a resort in Rome, Baiae, it's not really the thing that makes a difference here. So I'm going to show a few slides, so bear with me. This is the way most beaches were used. Fisher folk would simply bring the fish up on the beach, lay them out, and you bought them there. Whether you were looking as a fishmonger for your store, whatever, but this is the fisher folk at Scheveningen in the Netherlands. And here's one of the things that starts it out. The man called Sir John Floyer. This is published any number of times, in which cold bathing, touted as an ancient Hippocrates loved it, according to Floyer, and that this is something everybody should do. Cold water, and of course, this is a little ice age, so England is surrounded by cold water. That's not a problem. But this begins to flow with other people, a man called Richard Russell. Well, okay, if cold water is good, boy, seawater is a heck of a lot better. It's colder and it's got lots of good stuff in it. And also there's a virtue of sea air, which they work up as also being something very virtuous. So the very beginning is really something that deals with health and with well-being. It is not recreation, it's not having fun. You go to the beach in order to do something therapeutic, namely get in the water. And here is the very first image we have of such a scene. This is Scarborough in northern England, where the water is really brisk. But Scarborough is already something of a resort. These buildings over in the lower left-hand corner you can see, they are where some mineral water burbles up, and Scarborough is a spa. There are a lot of spas in England, about 150 of them, places where mineral waters burble to the surface, and of course, most famous is Bath, which has been famous since Roman times. But you can see here people actually in the water getting around, people jumping out boats here. These are mostly men. We don't really know who the person is getting out from the little wagon in the middle of the picture, whether it's male or female. But they are in the water and they're there for therapeutic reasons. They're there to get, in this case, not to be using the spa water, but using salt water. And Scarborough, this is 1735, but about the same time, Margate and Brighton in the south of England, where the water is not that much warmer, but the weather's somewhat better, quickly become new places for people to go who have the means to go. It's not something that you can do casually. You've got to get to these communities where at the edge of everything, and not easy to get to unless you have your own carriage. So what I'm saying is, these are only places upper class folks can go to. This is a painting by Benjamin West. West is an American. He ends up being King George III's history painter, long history. And this is the scene at Ramsgate. And you can see all sorts of things going on here. These, I'll come on to this again in a minute. This is a bathing machine. and they are what you get into. And again, let me come on to this in a minute. But these two women are escorting this early man. He's even got a jug. He's ready to drink this stuff, which was also recommended as being good for you, although I hardly think that would be the case. And then here's this woman here in the blue is a dipper who is dipping this woman. And this man is also a dipper, and he's bringing this child back in to the mother. Two boys here running into the water nude. Men, boys or men, swam nude. Now, that's not really possible for women, aristocratic women particularly, even though this woman indicates that, well, maybe these women are nude. Not really. Women wear these long smocks from the neck down to the ankles to protect them. I mean, aristocratic women don't go to the beach to show themselves to fisher folk nude. And so this has all these elements of a foreshore picture in it. But let me turn for a minute to the bathing machine, a great English invention. If it's important for women to retain their modesty and not appear semi-naked, nude, or any other condition except fully dressed, this machine is there to do that. You come in at the back end. It's kind of hard when the hood is down, but when the hood is up, you can get into the back end, and then you change in the little cabin here. Put on again, a dress, it's a smock that hangs down to your ankles. And then the machine turns, or it's turning around, meanwhile taking you out into the water, and then you're dipped. And this is a device in order to give women privacy, modesty. They're not going to be rolled around in the water. Now, all you need for therapeutic purposes is 3 dips. That's all you need, 3 dips. So this is all key to doing that. Dipping you, getting you back, taking you back. And then you got the rest of the day to play with. But here's the babe, and this is a business card for a man, the Sayers in Margate and the machine. And this is his device, actually, to protect women's modesty. Well, here's Mermaids of Brighton, which gives you some idea. The hooded thing never took over at Brighton. It's big at Margate and Ramsgate, and there's one here, but in reality, Brighton is really, you come out the back door and that's it. And here you can see 2 women who are about to dip this woman. These other women are more or less on their own, which they really wouldn't be. Almost immediately, as soon as this new world is being created with people being dipped and things happening to them, satire takes place. And people are sort of, well, what goes on there? And so people are always creating these crazy images of what goes on there. And you can see these women are fully clothed. They may be rolling around, which they really wouldn't do. Because the whole thing for these women, they own these cabins, the bathing machine. They want to get you out there, dip you, get you back, and get the next customer in. That's what it's all about. And some people go even a step further. Thomas Rowlandson could never keep himself from making fun, real fun, and somewhat, for a time, pornographic fun of what's going on at the beach. And again, you get the image, these women all go into the water naked. No, 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 not naked. You could read a ton of diaries, and I read a ton of diaries. They're dressed, again, in this sort of shroud that goes from your neck down to your ankles. But Rowlandson was always out looking for a little pornography, and he found it here. And so, though, even though, and again, you've got naked women here, not so. But there's still the possibility that once you get out there, a wave can come along, tumble you up, that costume would come down your buttocks or something. Anyway, telescopes were always a feature of beach life, if nothing else to look at the ships. But unfortunately, there is all this prurient interest also. Summer amusement at Margate. Ta-da. And even they can make fun of the king. You don't want the king to know it, but here we are, King George III's first bathe. We all know that George had a serious illness. And 14 times he came to Weymouth. This is the place he liked, the resort he liked. And this is developed after Margate and Brighton and Scarborough. But the king comes out and he's ushered out into the water. And there actually is a band in the water that plays God Save the King when he hits the water. So this is not that fanciful, but it is kind of fanciful nonetheless. I mean, George did dip. He did want the healthy influence. He also brought his own private physician to the beach with him to oversee all of this. This is his valet in the background. And this creature in the back machine who's climbing in and buttocks are bare, may be making a political statement, I don't know. But again, satire steps into this pretty early on. But as this is also the world of Jane Austen, because okay, you're dip, well, maybe that takes you an hour. Then you've got to spend the rest of your time. And all they do is transfer over spa culture, the world of Jane Austen. Assembly rooms, balls, meals, gambling, all the things that go on in the assembly rooms. And one of the things that goes on is, of course, if it's associated with if you read your Jane Austen, one of the problematic things for women is marriage. And here you have a dowager. It's been the worst season I can remember, Sir James. All the men seem to have got married and none of the girls. And here she is with 5 girls, hopeful that something's going to happen. But this just indicates how very quickly, this is actually a 19th century image, but very quickly, the big resorts also become marriage markets, the same as the season in the big cities, particularly London. Well, again, satire takes over, and the big aristocratic, the really high class resort is Brighton. The beauties of Brighton sort of satirizes. This isn't, you may, if you've ever been there, or you may have ever seen images of the Prince Regent George's palace pavilion at Brighton. It does have domes like this, but I mean, this just is monstrous. It's not that big. And in front of it are all the sort of panoply of creatures that could be found waltzing around Brighton. Most of them come down from London for the season at the beach, particularly since the prince comes there often, and since he's the head of a rather racy group called the Ton. You want to be at Brighton in the summer. And so here we are, the beauties of Brighton. Anyway, let me stop sharing that now and we'll get on with things. Sorry. Anyway, I thought you should see where it all starts, no matter where it is now.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. And the images are really great. And, the fact that you've pulled them all together, and it really adds to the story. And I just like to, I thought it was interesting when I read the book, some of the similarities and differences in those early beach communities of Weymouth and Brighton and Blackpool, in terms of the different kinds of people. Well, first of all, the different geography, but also the types of beachgoers who went there, and the class issues and some of the other issues, even some of the facilities. The difference between those three beach resorts, I thought was quite interesting. You might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, all of them attract local elites. Brighton is only 50 odd miles away from London, and so it's the big catchment area for London. Margate's also reasonably close, gets a selection from London society. But elsewhere, you're really drawing, Scarborough, for instance, draws in the northern gentry and some of the Scottish aristocracy. Blackpool also attracts people, elites from the local area, Manchester particularly. The big change will come in the early 19th century when the railway comes along, and technology over time is going to have a big impact on beach resorts. None more so than the train, because it's going to introduce wholly new characters to beach communities. It now means that you don't need to own a carriage and horses, which you needed to own before in order to get to the beach. You could get there in the great mechanical monster. And the trains at first also only feature aristocratic travelers going to the beach, but they quickly realize, hey, there's money here. We go on the weekend, we can pick up a lot of people. And while the Sabbath and the Sabbatarians are very strong, nonetheless, a lot of people, hey, and they'll run special trains down to the beach. And you've got to make up your mind as a resort, who are you going to play to? And the great popular beach will be Blackpool. However, it starts out, it always keeps an aristocratic element at the very north end of the beach. But they develop a really popular audience coming in from all the great workshops of the Midland of England. Liverpool is just south, and it's the great offloading place for cotton that then will pour into the Midlands and create the huge textile industry that's there. Those folks all come to Blackpool. And so there will be other beaches similarly. Weymouth will remain very aristocratic because the royal family is there. But over time, you in a sense have to make a decision as to who your audience is. And that's where resorts have to begin to go in different directions. And the same thing will happen in this country. Coney Island's Coney Island, Newport is Newport. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue actually into one of the things that I found interesting about your book was that by 1840, this beach phenomenon that you've described is crossing the Atlantic. It's reaching the American side of the Atlantic, and one of the things that I thought was interesting was that, of course, the beach resorts are going to develop in the American context, and some of the more upper class British people who came to visit were not altogether enthusiastic about some aspects of the American beach resorts. And we might want to talk a little bit about what was different about them and why it was and what impact that had.
British tourists are very interesting. I'll just say that France and America are quite similar. Belgium, Netherlands, Germany are very British with bathing machines and everything, but France and America go in different directions. And let me just talk about America. When they come, they're quite appalled because there's mixed bathing. In England, if men bathe nude, they've got to do it either early in the morning, nobody else can be there, or they do it away down the beach, and the women are way down the beach in the other direction. If the beach is big enough, you can separate them geographically. If it's not big enough, you do it by time. In America, men and women always went to the beach together, as was true in France. And so when the British tourists come, and their number of Harriet Martineau, for instance, is sort of appalled. But the other thing is there's no bathing machines. What the French and the Americans do is put up little huts at the back of the beach where you change. You're not being trundled down in this machine. You just change it out, leave it closed, and off you go down to the beach. In you go. And one of the things is that with mixed bathing, and it may well be mixed bathing is popular more because of the Atlantic is pretty boisterous, shall we say, and men and women together. And there are a lot of images of this right on the beginning. And again, the British travelers are appalled. And when they see it in France, well, God, that's the French. You know them. But the Americans really, there they are out there, men and women together. The difference is, if men swim nude in America, and they do, it's early in the morning. Mixed bathing comes along, and the men are, from the very beginning, wearing bathing costumes. It's not a matter of they're nude and their partner is fully clothed. Everybody will be fully clothed. And in fact, early on in America, since they're not doing this whole business with nude, shrouds and whatnot, bathing machines, they really just wear old clothes to the beach. There are images of, men and women jumping up and down in the water together, and they're wearing old clothes. They're not going in for bathing costumes. That will come along in time, and it will start with the upper classes. Lower class people will just keep wearing whatever the hell they got. Sorry.
And did the American early beach resorts, did the upper class Americans and the lower class, whatever you want to call them, working class people, did they interact in new ways in these beach resorts or in these beach areas?
Now again, getting to the beach is the same. I mean, American resorts begin in 1820, and you've got the same issue. How do you get there? And that's carriage and horses. And again, you're talking about elites, and particularly from New York. Boston goes to Nahant, New York go to Long Branch, other places in North. The New Jersey coast is the site of the real origins of American bathing. And at the very tip of New Jersey, Cape May has the best claim to being the earliest beach, and they serve Philadelphia. So these folks at first are coming the same way. Once the trains start, then again, you've got to make up your mind what population. At Nahant in Massachusetts Bay, it's the codfish aristocracy. They're in the hotel, they own all the villas, and wealthy people start building villas at the beach early on. Even in Britain, it's the same story. And so it's not a different story in terms of social class. It'll come in America with the rise of places like Atlantic City, which is created as a therapeutic. All these, again, it's the same pattern. These are all therapeutic resorts. You go not for recreation, you go for therapeutics. And the same thing, Atlantic City, which is a straight shot. You go across the river to Camden, you get on the train and it runs straight across right into Atlantic City. And so Atlantic City develops early on as a place where a lot of different people go. Remember, most working class people, even middle class people, can't really go until Sunday. And it's not until you get on later in the 19th century when paid holidays become a feature of life. And that's a very, very slow process that will come down into the middle class before it comes down to the working class, that'll allow people to think about even going away to the beach for more than a day.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things that struck me about the book was this evolution from going to the beach for therapeutic reasons to going to the beach for recreational reasons or entertainment or drinking or other kinds of behavior that you don't get to do maybe at home, or that you do differently at home, whether you're in the upper class or whether you're in the working class.
Yeah, again, in Britain, it's the assembly room. Again, Jane Austen fans will know all about assembly rooms and what goes on there. In America, the hotels will take over all those rules. There's no assembly rooms in America. The hotels do it all. They have the space for the balls. They have the space for the big dinners. They have the space for musicals, hops, which are the popular dance forms. That all develops in the process of the 19th century everywhere. Hotels will really take over the role of the assembly room. And the hotels get bigger and bigger and bigger as a result, and be able to absorb more and more folks. But this function of entertainment in the hotel and also out on the beach, again, there's a lot of entertainment on the beach before it moves up into the boardwalk. And then with the boardwalk in Atlantic City, Coney Island, these places begin to serve bigger and bigger numbers of people. And at the same time, when you come to the beach, by this time, it's one of the other things I've had to learn is a little fashion history. As a 17th century specialist, not something I knew much about, but women's bathing suits slowly evolve into those long sort of shrouds to something that comes down to their knees, and then they wear a pair of Persian pants from their waist to their ankles, but that allows them to jump up and down in the water. And so, they can have a little fun. From the 1860s on, women and women's magazines are being encouraged to swim. So that will force the evolution of the swimming suit some more into what we would see as an extended tank suit, where it comes down to the middle of your thighs. But you have to be extremely careful. Annette Kellerman, who's a champion swimmer, an Australian and a great, great swimmer, gets arrested in Massachusetts when she's wearing her tank suit as a depraved person. And women are still being arrested on the beach in Atlantic City in the 1920s. Now, nowadays, you can get arrested on a French beach for wearing a burkini, which gets you all the way from your knee, from your chin to your knee, well, your ankle actually, or a proper burkini. So, this whole business of women's bathing suits is always contested ground.
Yeah, that was interesting. And that's actually one of the things I was going to ask you was about, it's very interesting. Your chapter 5 is a very provocative title called Can a Proper Victorian Be Nude? But actually the evolving culture of beaches had an impact on fashion, and somewhat vice versa as well, I think. It seems that way.
Yeah.
What about for men? What about fashions for men?
Well, you don't need much when you're swimming nude, but slowly but surely, and the real battleground over this is in England. And it's a matter, at the beginning of the century, there's a great evangelical revival inside the Anglican Church, and then there are the Methodists and other groups come along that, men exposing themselves in public, not quite what they're advocating. And then some of the press will also pick up this whole business of men bathing and almost, being too close to women at the beach. And there's even notice of women noticing the man nude. And we can't have that going on. And so slowly but surely, by the 1850s, the 1860s, the resorts in Britain begin to, you must wear, a calico, which is a set of drawers essentially with a top. You've got to have a top because you can't show your breasts. Even though you don't have them, you can't show them. So they mandate that, but then they have to police it. And then the problem is policing it because men will still walk down to the beach early in the morning nude. And it's not really till the 1880s, 1890s that they get a real authority in this and begin mandating the suit we all recognize as a kind of a vaudeville costume that is from your neck. You have bare arms, but it comes down over your body, down to your knees. And that's a common costume then all over the place for men to wear. But in Britain, it's a new thing. The irony is, of course, that that's at the end of the 19th century. At the very beginning of the 20th century begins the naturist movement and brings out the whole business of nudity, which, is best done at the beach.
Now, just kind of moving forward, chronologically, World War II had such a big impact on the world. It had a major impact, as you mentioned in the book, on beaches, because beaches were used where wars were fought, were initiated, where landings took place. And yet very quickly after the end of the war, all around the world, the beach became, and the beach resort and the whole beach experience became something that people were very, very interested in, and larger numbers of people flocked to. And it's sort of, historians that look at the 20th century always kind of look at World War II as this breaking point between, the end of this and the beginning of this. And I found some of that in your chapter as well. You might want to talk a little about that, Roy.
Yeah, again, during the war, well, especially in England, you couldn't go to the beach. I mean, you literally couldn't, because a lot of them were places where they were fortified because of the possibility of a German invasion, particularly in the south and the east, not so much in the west. But nonetheless, it's, you're really not being patriotic unless you're in there, work, work, work. And the war is an extraordinary stressful time for millions of people who are threatened by bombing, whose, members of their family are at risk. It's just, an enormous relief when in May, 1945, the fighting ends in Europe, later in the Pacific. But at that point, everybody wants to have a holiday and to get over this. And so there's an extraordinary rush to the beaches because they have become, by this time, the #1 place for people to go on holiday. And that explosion of people after World War II will then begin. Interesting that the Spanish government's looking at all these people running off to the beach thinking, hey, we've got great beaches. And it's the Spanish government that then begins to put money into and attract the hotels into creating Benidorm, all the other beaches that people were rushed to. And the other, by this time too, charter flights make getting there easier. Even if you go by train, that's easier too. A lot of really good beaches are around the Barcelona area, which are developed at this time. So Mexican governments the same way takes advantage of this just explosion of people running off into the holiday looking for, something from what they've been going through with rationing, with stress of, loved ones being away, with the threat of being bombed, all of that just is, it just, instead of having 1 million or 2 people at a season in places like Coney Island, they very quickly go to 20 million people going to Coney Island in the summer season.
Yes, and so this explosion of interest in the beach and in the beach community and in that whole experience across the globe is so interesting and sort of lays, some of the groundwork for some of the later chapters in your book where, and in particular, I thought one called the title of the chapter, Who Owns the Beach? Mm-hmm. And here you have a quote where you say, California beaches attracted more visitors than all the national parks combined. And this raises the question of how we, even in today, how do we square the public demand for access to these beaches, which we all want, with the responsibility of government agencies like the California Coastal Commission to protect those same beaches from despoilment or from being overused. These, as well as some of the other environmental issues, which you talk about too, are challenges that face us today. Admittedly, as you pointed out, our understanding of the history of the beach enables us, perhaps, one would hope, to better understand how we can deal with these challenges in the contemporary period.
Well, there are sort of, 2 issues here, one of which is access. It's pretty universal. The California rule you'll find almost in every state, and that is people have free access to the beach up to the mean high tide line. The problem comes from what's after the mean high tide line. If there's nothing there, you can just walk right down to the beach, or if there's a parking lot, you just walk right down to the beach. It doesn't really matter what's there. But if the property above the beach is held privately, which is the case in many, many beaches in America, you have a conflict. And of course, here in Los Angeles, and I'm assuming most of us from LA, Malibu is the great example where people in Malibu, and if you spend 20, 30, 40, even now there's been $100 million purchase in Malibu. Do you want the hoi polloi prancing around on the beach in front of your $100 million home? So that kind of access is one thing. And one of the demographics is now more than 50% of the people in the United States live in a county adjacent to the ocean, whether it's the Atlantic, the Gulf, or the Pacific. So the number of people that are out along the coast grows and grows. As that happens, of course, that puts more and more pressure on all the terrain behind the beaches in order who is going to have access. We're very lucky in California to have miles and miles and miles of public beaches. That's not true everywhere. And so that really is a problematic issue that bedevils us. I mean, there are 2 or 3 cases that the Coastal Commission is involved in. Coastal Commission has taken its job as twofold. One is to ensure access, that the people of California get to enjoy going to the beach. You can't cut them off. Well, hey, then the other part of it comes with, okay, we have to save the beach as an entity. And the problem here is another issue that, I treat in the book, but something I came to, I didn't know an awful lot about, but in the end, I had to deal with it. And that is sea level rise. Mm. The Pacific has already gone up 8 inches from what it used to be in places like Imperial Beach in San Diego County. Every high tide now, king tide, they're sloshing. The coastal road is sloshing. In Key West, Florida, same thing, high tide, coastal. Miami Beach, same thing. These places are all being inundated. And in California, the Coastal Commission is saying, look, we have to save the beaches. Well, how do we save the beaches? Well, Coastal Commission mandates manage retreat. We have to back away and let the beach move inland, because beaches will move. If they're allowed to move, the sand will move inland. We know this happened, for instance, after the last ice age. The barrier islands in North Carolina, at that point were not. The beach was 300 feet lower and a lot further out. And then once the ice age ended 12,000 years ago, slowly but surely the beaches backed up. And so now you have the barrier islands there, very nice. But behind the barrier islands now is an almost solid wall of condominiums and hotels. Where's the beach going to go to? And particularly since these people have paid a lot of wonderful dollars, their dollars to live on the beach, they're not taking too kindly to being told, hey, what we have to do is a managed retreat. I lived in Del Mar for 22 years, and Del Mar has already clashed with the Coastal Commission. Managed retreat, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. Have fun, but it's not going to happen here in Del Mar. But in the end, unfortunately, if indeed what the scientists are saying is so about the ocean, and the worst case scenario, at the end of this century, the sea will be 15 feet higher than it is now.
Yes.
That's the worst case scenario. Even the best case scenario, let's just say it's 5 feet. Ta-da! I'm afraid a lot of Del Mar is going to be underwater. Places like Shanghai will be underwater. Places like New York City will be underwater. Mumbai will be underwater. Again, just with 5 there, great port cities are great port cities. Why are they great port cities? Because they're right at sea level. And the sea level goes up. Ooh. And if you have big storms included, as we do, as we're promising we're going to get more and more big storms, it's going to get very nasty indeed.
Roy, I think this is one of the really compelling things about your book that I really liked. We got to the last chapters. You've described some of your research and some of what you've talked about, and we're struck by the reality and the difficulty of how we would actually confront this, and I think in some ways it shows, in a certain sense, the importance of historical research, that we can go back in time to understand the evolution of the beach culture and the beach resorts and the importance that people put on the beaches. We begin to understand that history, that evolution. And, one would hope that if more people understood more about that, they would also have a better sense of the things that we need to do, how we can utilize. In other words, that the history that we do is not just a decorative history that talks about these interesting people or this interesting thing that happened here or there. Something that's very interesting to us it's an individual, it's an interesting thing that happened, but also something but beyond that, a history that's useful, that allows us to analyze the situation in the contemporary time, see where we came from, how did we get here? And that may be understand how we need to unravel it, maybe how we need to understand the beach culture as it recedes and how we deal with that in the future. And I think that's the value of your book. So, Roy, congratulations on a great achievement. It's a wonderful book. It's very unusual. And I think that's a real strength of the book, Roy. I'd like to open it up. I know I see there's a couple of chats here, and I think I'm going to let Kelsey, if you're still there, maybe you can pick it up, and maybe there are some questions from the audience. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roy, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Roy. We do have 2 questions that have come in on the chat, and for anyone else here tonight, you can definitely send in more questions or unmute yourself and ask if you would like. But I'm going to take this first one from Shelley, who asked earlier in the evening, were these beach resorts on public property or privately owned? I think this was in regards to something very specific.
Beach resorts like to be privately owned. They like to own the beach in front of them. In fact, the rule, though, is universal about mean high tide, that you have public access up to that level. The issue then becomes, how are you going to get there, as I've said before. And the situation in Venice, for instance, the Lido, which is the great beach of Venice, slowly but surely in the 19th century was taken over by hotels, so that by the end of the 19th century, the public could only get access to the Lido through a turnstile they had to put money into. The rest of the beach was really dominated by all the big hotels. And again, that just grew up. That, you can go to an Italian beach and try to get access to the beach. I mean, the resorts really work very hard, control the area in front of them. And in some places, these are essentially private beaches, and the law allows a private beach. Not all countries allow private beaches, but some do. Italy's one of them, for instance. So again, it's this whole issue of access and how are we all going to get to the beaches that we like. It's going to be a tough issue going forward.
Would you say there are any benefits of privately owned beaches?
The privately owned beaches are great for the resorts. That's what they want. They don't want people coming in and enjoying what they have. If you want to come to the bar and have a drink, that's one thing, but they don't want you wandering through and going into the water, then coming back and sitting underneath one of their umbrellas. They really want to keep it very exclusive. And beach resorts have fought to do that. Again, it hasn't worked everywhere. Here in Southern California, well, there are bits and pieces. Well, the Jonathan Club is I think the sole surviving club now. One time there were 10 or 12 clubs in the 1920s that controlled a good deal of the beach, but they all failed during the Depression. And so, there have been attempts to control the beach. It's been difficult, but here in Southern California, the state, the county, and the city all bought up a lot of beach property to make possible our, having a favorite beach where you can run down, park, get out of your car, hit the beach, that's great. but that's very Southern California. A lot of places in the world, Northern Argentina, for instance, there's a series of exclusive beaches that you don't get onto unless you're a member of the club. And that started in the late 19th century. Andrew Carnegie's brother created a very exclusive club in Georgia on the coast. And if you looked at the list of people, families who had access to it, they were among the wealthiest in America. And there's still, clubs like that, but that's not been really the American pattern. Public beaches started in Massachusetts in the 1890s, and they've come to be a significant part of American life.
Interesting.
So don't go to Connecticut. They have a lot of private beaches in Connecticut.
On that note, Allison asks, do you look at the Methodist resorts like Martha's Vineyard in the book?
Pardon me?
Did you look at any of the Methodist resorts like Martha's Vineyard?
Oh, sure. No, I mean, you have to write about them because it's this wonderful American institution. It's very hard to find, well, you can find religious beaches elsewhere in the world, but they're very different from the creation in America. In the early 19th century, there's this whole set of revivals that we sort of loosely call the Second Great Awakening. And the Methodists come through that. They're already present, but they're flourishing, and they flourish more. And there are all these tent meetings everywhere. People will go in for days or even a week and be preached at and have an experience. Come to Jesus. Well, a bunch of Massachusetts Methodists decide they could do that on Martha's Vineyard. And so that's the first one. Then Asbury Park in New Jersey, there's even a Baptist resort in New Jersey. And again, these also really try to control the beach in front of them because they're Sabbatarians. They don't want anybody at the beach on Sunday. There's no recreation. There's no frivolity. You should be serious and, come to God on Sunday. The rest of the week, you go in the water, that's fine. But their bathing suits are very, very, very modest. But yes, there's the Methodists are written up in the book in all their modesty. They almost lose control of the resort in Martha's Vineyard. It becomes very, very popular. And they urge everybody to buy, and put up little cabins and little Victorian structures all along behind the beach in order to control the foreshore leading up to the beach to keep it theirs.
Wow, it's quite impressive. We've got another question, which might be a really lovely way to end the evening, from David, who's asking, how did you find the work of Kim Stanley Robinson, whose Aurora closes at the very end of your book?
I love reading history and I read a lot of it, but I like to read other things now and then. And I read murder mysteries. And I don't read as much science fiction as I used to, but I do read some. My wife is more of a science fiction fantasy person. And she tells me, oh, you should read this book. So I read Aurora. And there is that striking scene at the very end where, I forget the heroine's name again, who comes back to her. They, very quickly, this is the group of people, multi-generational, go out to another planet. The Earth is now expanding and taking over everything they can. And they've, conquered light speed. Anyway, the ship goes out. When they get to the planet they've been assigned, it's a real killer. I mean, you can't stay there. And so they come back to Earth. She comes back. And of course, they're failures. They should have, done the right thing. Should have stayed, maybe. And in the meanwhile, the Earth has changed dramatically. And one aspect of it is, the old beaches are gone. They're all underwater. And so, the people who come back are very depressed. Some of them are killing themselves, whatnot. And then the heroine falls in with a group of people who are creating beaches. They're really committed to it. And she comes to this, and it's totally new to her to go into the water this way. But there's a young surfer close by who's naked man at the beach. So he said, "Oh, you have to come in. This is just great. You'll love it." And she goes in and has this incredible rush of emotions, fair amount of erotic emotion relating to the young nude surfer, but that's another matter. And she, changes, it lifts away all the pain and agony of coming back, and she's made anew. As I thought about it, that's the way I wanted to end the book. The people went to the beach because they want to be made anew. They did it in the 18th century, and by God, they're doing it in the 21st.
So, Roy, that's a great way to kind of come to the end of it, because one of the starting points in your book were those early beachgoers, those early, you called them pajammers, common folks in England. They walked for 30, 40 miles to get to the seaside. They bathed in mixed company, usually unclothed, and those are the original beachgoers. Yeah. So that's a great way to round the whole thing off. Thank you.
Fine by me.
Well, thank you, Roy, so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Darryl, for wonderful questions, and everyone who came out. This was really fun. And I feel like we're never going to look at the beach the same again.
I think you're right. Thanks,
Kelsey. Thanks, Darryl. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Ron.